In tech sales in particular, I remember running a discovery, like an entire discovery call, like the prospect was holding her baby, and the baby was just like screaming bloody murder. She was like having a tantrum, and I'm just trying to keep it together.
Welcome to Outbound, where we talk about strategies and tactics to help you build deeper relationships with your ideal customers. Today, I have Juan Arcila on with me. He is an account executive that helps growing SaaS companies close new business. And I specifically wanted to have Juan on because I've known him for a while, and our introduction was from outreach that he did and personalize it and connect it with me. So I had him on my previous podcast because he had done, I'd consider it warm outbound, where the company he was working for had built rapport, but then he reached out to me with a very well-crafted, clearly researched email, and it caught my attention. And I wasn't in a position to buy from him at that point, but we've built a relationship that's been ongoing for quite some time. And so I wanted him to share some of his knowledge about how to connect with people in a personalized way. And so, yeah, Juan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Joseph. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, what is the strategy that's worked most effectively for you to build relationships with your ideal customers?
Yeah, I think as a seller, it's important to have a tool belt of different skills, of different strategies and tactics that you can pull out at a moment, depending on the situation. But it's good to have like a North Star, a framework, if you will, of how to approach sales. So to me, I think of it as radical honesty. So from the first interaction that I have with a prospect, I want to be as upfront and as honest as possible. Because the common trope or stereotype with sellers is that we're dishonest, right? We're kind of a sleazy car salesperson that's trying to get one over you. So starting from like the get-go, I'm a big proponent of cold calling. So when I call somebody and get somebody on the phone, I don't tell them like, "Hey, how are you?" Because that's a little bit disingenuous. I don't really know them. It's kind of like a default
Hmm.
kind of remark, and they can give you a default answer. You're like, "Oh yeah, good," or they hang up on you. I tell them right up front, it's like, "Hey, I'll be completely upfront, and you're probably gonna hate me for this, but this is actually a cold call. Not sure if that makes you want to slam your phone against the wall or let me have 30 seconds. It's up to you." And more often than not, that gets a chuckle, and especially from like the C-suite or VPs are like, "Oh, just for saying that, I'm willing to kind of give you 30 seconds." So radical honesty, just putting yourself out there, I think goes a long way.
Yeah, I love that. And especially when it comes to cold calling, because I know you and I have had conversations about this. I'm not a huge fan of cold calling, but part of the reason is because so many people do it horribly. They're not doing any research. They don't know who I am. They're not really even in line with pain points and problems. It's just they scrape my stuff from Zoom Info and feel like they have the right to call me 5 times in a day. And it's like, dude, not interested in
Yeah.
what you're selling. Like, find me where I'm actually spending time. But um, I think that approach where you're taking that, um, having that radical transparency and really kind of putting them first in that sense and giving them the opportunity to be like, hey, this isn't great, or I'm not interested off the bat. And to your point, if somebody called me and they said that, I probably actually would at least give them time to tell me why they're calling and open up the door.
Yeah, absolutely. Just being transparent, being upfront. I mean, that's an actual pattern interrupt. A lot of people talk about pattern interrupt in emails and calling, and the best one is just like literally being honest. Putting yourself out there, and so some people might be in a bad mood and then may not be willing to have the conversation. But if you catch them off guard and like, it's the right timing, like you can at least have a conversation and see where you can take the relationship moving forward.
And that radical honesty applies not only to when you're making a cold call like that. So if people who are listening, cold calling isn't the way that they, are reaching out to people. I know you'd mentioned a couple different ways that applies, through pricing specifically, or bringing up the hard conversations first. Could you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, no, absolutely. In my previous role, I was at a startup and we didn't really have a lot of name recognition. So I wanted to kind of try different things, see what really works, see what doesn't. And one of the things that I experimented with was the beginning of my discovery call. So instead of going to that typical upfront contract, like, "Hey, if we're not a good fit, we can part ways," or like, if we it is a good fit, let's schedule a demo. I mean, that has its place, but at the beginning, I'm like, "Hey, before we jump into the call, can I tell you the three reasons why we're probably not going to end up working together?" And they're not used to hearing that. They're used to kind of that initial offer contract, the seller setting an agenda, guiding the conversation. And it's kind of like on autopilot for them. But being upfront, being radically honest with them and telling upfront, like, here are the three reasons, one is pricing. We're a premium solution. If you're looking for a product that's cheap or like an entry level product, we may not be the best fit. Second is timing. If you don't have the time and resources to invest in an evaluation, probably not going to be the best fit for you because we require implementation, a POC, and then whatever the third reason that you want to throw in there, right? So front loading those hard conversations first, it's a great way to build rapport and trust with your ideal customer.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important because the times I've been most frustrated in a B2B complex sale environment that most of us are operating in, it's when people are not upfront, especially about pricing. Because usually I know what the price is I know what price that we can afford. And there's no amount of, premium solution or extra features or differentiation that's going to all of a sudden magically create 10 times what the budget is that I have. And so if people are upfront with that at the beginning, it just saves a ton of time where I'm like, okay, well, it's not going to be a fit because I know the client that I'm working with has $5,000 and you guys start at 50. It's not even, we're not going to waste time either way. But then in the future, if they were honest like that, I'll want to reach out to them and, I'll have that in mind when I'm going into it, or maybe try to go back and rework the budget and then come back to them and go, hey, I would like to try to work with you after all. Whereas if you don't share that, and I've had that happen most of the time, you get to the very end, they finally share the price after they took an hour meeting and turned it into an hour and a half and shared all these slides. And they're like, okay. And it's, $50,000. And you're like, okay, well, it's not going to be a good fit. It's like, then you feel cheated and like they wasted a bunch of your time.
Yeah, no, that's annoying. Just being a buyer and being on the other side of things as well. And also like a lot of sellers, they kind of want to hope that if they provide enough value up front, that the price at the end wouldn't be a big shock for the person, right? For the prospect that you're speaking to. Like, yeah, let's have a conversation. Let's identify the pain point. Let's quantify the pain. And then at the end, whatever I give them, it's not going to matter because, hey, this is how much the problem is costing you. And this is how much your solution costs. A is higher than B. Like, obviously, you should buy us, right? But if you physically don't have the budget and the bank to pay for you,
right.
I mean, they can't just put it out of nowhere. So I think it is important to be just transparent and have those conversations up front, and they'll respect you for it, like you said. And if there isn't a good fit right now, down the line, you can have a good customer or they could refer you, right? It's all about building those relationships.
Yeah, and I want to get back on track here, but one thing that is really important about that is, to me, that's kind of where marketing or creating a personal brand or doing those sides of things, the side of things I really have focused on is helpful, because you can be building that value upfront before they're ready to buy. But by the time they get on a discovery call with you, they've already defined their requirement. Almost always, they've defined their requirements. They know what they need. They have a budget, and it's almost too late at that point to really be consultative, unless to a degree. I mean, it depends on the situation, but you kind of have lost that opportunity already if you don't reach them early enough in the buying decision, because they've already kind of figured it out. They've gone to their boss. They've gotten approval for solving XYZ. And so anyway, if you can reach them ahead of time, be building that rapport, be starting that conversation before they're ready to buy, that's where you build that upfront value. And then when you get on the call, they already understand and, put your pricing on your website so that they come into the call prepped with that already. Anyway, I don't want to derail the conversation because that's not something most sellers can can do much about. So tell me about a time when you've had that radical transparency or radical honesty and it's paid off for you.
Yeah, in my previous role, I was selling to a large CPG company, consumer packaged goods. They were a company that manufacture like blenders and other types of kitchenware. So I started the conversation by cold calling one of the directors of product development. And it went to voicemail. I'm like, okay, well, whatever. And I just hung up. But she called me right back right afterwards. She's like, hey, who's this? I just got a missed call. And I could have gone through the regular spiel. I was like, hey, I'm calling from XYZ. How are you today? But I'm like, let me just try a different approach. Let me just be honest. Like, hey, I mean, you're probably going to hate me, but this is actually a sales call. I'm not sure if you want to hang up on me after that or just give me 30 seconds. And she laughed. She's like, oh, what's up? Kind of like a friend. She's like, oh, okay, what's up? And I went through my pitch, here's the 3 problems that we help solve. And we just continued the conversation. And it turned out that she was in the market for the type of product that I was selling. And she was open to have a discovery call. So we got on a discovery call the next week, and I started off in a similar vein. It's like, hey, I know you said you're in the market for this, but can I tell you the 3 reasons why we may not be a good fit for you? Boom, pricing, boom, timing, evaluation period. And she kind of, said like, no, we're okay with all those things. It really just depends on the value and things like that. She was the one selling me on like the value conversation. And ultimately the conversation went well, discovery, we booked a demo, we did a scoping call, and they ended up being a customer. That was one of the first customers that I closed for that company.
Yeah, I really like starting the discovery call out that way too, because it kind of takes the tension out of the conversation and kind of almost puts them in the position of control in the conversation, and people like that. So what are some practical ways, 2 or 3 practical ways that people could, people listening to this conversation can start practicing radical honesty?
There's a few things, right? Like, look at your discovery call, look at the way you're running it. If you have Gong or if you have like whatever call recording platform you're using, go back to it and then see where the objections come up, right? Is it coming up in the middle of the conversation, towards the end? Is it on the 3rd call, right? And try to like put yourself in your prospect shoes and really understand like, what are they here for? What problems do they have? And how can you facilitate building trust with the buyer, right? Now, how can I move the sales cycle along? What's the best way that I can get to the next stage, to demo stage, to trial, to closing? But what can I do now to, be upfront, to be honest, and build that relationship? Because ultimately, they're going to drive that sales cycle for you in that way. So it could be like at the beginning, if you're not talking about price until the very end, front load that to the very beginning, right? If your product requires a very long evaluation period, front load it to the very beginning. If maybe you're in a holding pattern, maybe can you introduce them to a current customer as a case study, right? What can you do to kind of build that relationship? And I think honesty is the fuel that helps you drive that. But we're always focused on like, what's the next sales technique or sales tactic to, push it forward and close the deal faster. Just how can you build that relationship even more? I would say that's what I would do.
Yeah, everything you shared builds trust, takes tension out of the conversation, builds rapport. Those are all things that help deals move significantly faster, because those things are going to come up either during the sale or after the sale. Those things are going to come up. And so the sooner they come up in conversation, the more that it opens the door for them to have a say in the conversation and how it's going, and to address those things and qualify themselves out so that nobody's wasting their time unnecessarily. So what is the wildest thing that's happened to you since you've been in sales?
I've been in software sales for about 3 years, and it's mostly been remote, inside sales. So I haven't had like a door slammed at me or people cursing at me. Although I had a lot of that when I was doing telesurveys with Nielsen. I worked at the call center during college, and I talked to some wild people there. Yeah. Actually, I called the DEA at one point, thinking it was a prospect, and the person's like, yeah, this is the Drug Informants Agency. You do not want to be calling this. I'm like, oh, whoops. But
that's hilarious.
In tech sales in particular, I remember running a discovery, like an entire discovery call, like the prospect was holding her baby, and the baby was just like screaming bloody murder. She was like having a tantrum. And I'm just trying to keep it together, like going through kind of like my questions and trying to quantify the pain. It's like, oh, so what percentage of your marketing qualified leads convert? As the baby is like screaming out loud. She kept going. She didn't say like, oh, can we table this? I probably should have been a little bit more empathetic and kind of like, let's just end it now. But I was new to the role. I was like, no, I need to get this to the next step. Oh, man. And we ended up booking a demo eventually. So I guess it worked out.
You're like, your pain points and problems seem like they're not related to what we have to talk about today.
That's right.
Seems like it has a little bit more to do with a screaming baby than how many people are converting. Well, awesome. Juan, thank you so much for joining us today. And if you enjoyed this episode, definitely subscribe and leave us a 5-star rating, and tune in again next time for the next conversation about Outbound.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Joseph.